All right, well, you've got a pretty awesome event coming up. So I'm gonna let you get to it. The talk title, Walrus from Space. It almost sounds like a rock band or something. But
I know. I'm ready. You can't go wrong. Yeah, Walrus from Space. It's a great name for a rock band. It's slightly underneath the best rock band name in the world, which is Free Beer and Dancing Girls.
Absolutely. All right, Paul, we'll see you soon. Have a good session. I think you've got a triple header coming up.
I do. I'm ready. Thanks, Joe.
All right. See you, Paul.
See you later. Well, thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody. We're really on a roll here. As Joe said earlier, it felt as if we were sort of going underwater, riding this monster of something called the Global Biodiversity Festival. What the heck have we created? It's got so big, and it's global and multidisciplinary. It looks and feels and sounds like the planet. But luckily, it's worked out, and we're now surfing. And part of that is the way these have flowed together. Excuse me, losing my voice. So it's great pleasure now to introduce my two friends, Rod Downie, who I've worked with in Antarctica, and Peter Fretwell. Hi, fellas. How you doing?
Hello.
Hi, Paul. Great to see you again.
Great to see you again, buddy. I wish we were at Rotherham or on a ship or somewhere together. And Peter, we haven't worked together, but I've got your book.
Oh, excellent. I hope you enjoy it, Paul.
Absolutely. And we have a method which Joelle, my wife, invented, and that is that pretty much each day we have a page. So we leave a page open on the dining room table, just almost by random. And then in the morning, with the first cup of tea, we learn something.
That's fantastic. It was a joy to put the book together, and I hope it's really quite educational, but also really engaging to tell the story of a continent, really.
It's a lovely piece of work, and to look at polar history, polar science, and global issues through the lens of a map maker. Yeah. I mean, that is music to my ears, Peter. What's the next one?
Good question. Well, then we're going to give a talk about the Arctic, and maybe there's a similar one for the Arctic to be done over the next few years, I think.
That'd be fantastic. And Rod, it is so good to see you again. Holy smokes! I mean, it seems like an absolute lifetime ago we were at Rotherham together, British Antarctic Survey, and then I think cups of tea at headquarters and all the rest. But wow, how's things?
25 years ago, I think it was, Paul. I was just counting it up, and Paul was my first base commander in Antarctica, so I will always
25 years. Wow. Well, I'm excited about this talk. Walrus from Space. This is a combined project, WWF and British Antarctic Survey. We don't have a lot of time, fellas, so I'm gonna jump out and leave you to it and come back in, and I'm sure there'll be some lively questions. Thanks, fellas. Over to you.
All yours, Rod.
Thanks, Paul. So can you see my screen share now? Can you see the screen share now?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so thanks so much, Paul, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone around the world. It's such an honor to have been invited to come and speak to you today. So as Paul said, I'm Rod. I lead the polar program for WWF here in the UK. But I'm also the co-director, along with Peter, of this new and exciting science project. It's not a rock band. It's a science project, and it's called Walrus from Space. And the overarching aim is to provide evidence to help secure a future for walrus in the wild in the context of the climate crisis and the extreme ice loss that we're seeing in the Arctic. And we're going to do that by raising the profile of walrus. We're going to make it politically and socially unacceptable to destroy nature through man-made climate change and unsustainable development. But first of all, for those of you that might not be as familiar with walrus, then let me introduce you. So here we go. They're easily recognized by their sheer size. Some of these big guys can top the scales at more than 1.5 tons. And they're also recognizable from their magnificent tusks, which are surrounded by this mat of bristles. And it's the tusks that are really one of their most remarkable features. They use them for keeping breathing holes open. They use them for fighting, and they use them for hauling themselves out onto the ice floes. Now, Walrus are usually seen kind of amongst and moving around ice floes. They rarely venture far from the coast because they feed in quite shallow waters. They can dive to depths of 100 meters or more, but generally they're only diving to around 20 meters to feed on things like mollusks and other invertebrates that are found on the seabed. And they're not only a key species in the Arctic marine ecosystem, but they're also culturally very, very important and very significant to Arctic people and communities. And many of those people live in very close proximity to walrus. This is a map that Peter's prepared for us. I don't think it's made it into the book yet, but this shows the distribution of walrus around the Arctic. Now, they're only found in the Arctic, although saying that, we do have a vagrant that's making his way around the UK shores at the moment, but generally they're only found in the Arctic, and they have a circumpolar distribution. So they're found right across the Arctic. There are 2 to 3 subspecies of walrus. So firstly, the Pacific walrus. They're the most numerous. They're the most affected by change in the sea ice, and they're found predominantly in the Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. Then you have the Atlantic walrus, or Obidenus rosmarus, and they're found around the coasts of Canada, Greenland, and across to Svalbard and into Western Russia. And then there's the Laptev walrus. Now, the Laptev walrus is disputed. So some research points to Laptev walrus being the westernmost extent of the Pacific walrus, and there's ongoing science to try and resolve that conundrum. But the scope of our project is very much about Atlantic and Laptev walrus. And the problem that we face is that Arctic wildlife, Arctic nature, and also Arctic people are living on the front line of the climate crisis. So the region's warming at more than twice as fast as the global average. The region's in meltdown, sea ice is in dramatic decline, and walrus are really vulnerable to both the environmental and also human consequences of the climate crisis. And the reason why they're vulnerable is because they prefer to haul out on sea ice. They use sea ice as a platform. They breed on it. They give birth on the sea ice. They also use it as a platform to rest between feeding trips. Although some walrus will routinely also use beaches around the coast, in particular during the summer and the autumn. But with that sea ice declining, both in terms of the extent, but also in terms of the timing, in terms of the duration, then what we're seeing is that in some parts of the Arctic, walrus are forced to gather on shore in greater and greater numbers. And when they're there in big numbers, they can be easily disturbed, whether that's by human activities or by other predators. And then in the big walrus haul-outs, that causes a stampede, and some of the young walrus, some of the calves can get crushed, and it can be a really deadly event. So whilst in the past, the major threat to walrus has been commercial hunting, well, today, one of the main threats is likely to be climate change, the loss of sea ice, and also disturbance by human activity. So that's the challenge and the context to our project. And Walrus from Space, so the project as it is jointly led by WWF and by the British Antarctic Survey. But we also have many partners across the Arctic. We have partners working in Canada, in Greenland, in Norway, in Russia. And we're using satellite imagery, which is much less invasive than being in the colonies to do those counts. We're also hoping to call on the engagement of over 500,000 citizen scientists over the next 4 years to help us count walrus and to give us a clearer picture of the populations of both Atlantic and Laptev walrus. And we're working with these satellite imagery providers. They're called Maxar. They're going to provide a very high resolution satellite imagery using their WorldView 3 satellite and also their new Legion satellites that they'll be launching shortly. And This is the conceptual framework for the project. So it comprises 4 work packages over a 5-year total duration. So the first work package, we've mapped and we're going to image and count all of the Atlantic and Laptev haulouts. In the second work package, which you see there in green, we're going to calibrate those counts using imagery from drones that were taken at the same time as the satellites. And we use that to test our accuracy, but also will help to convert counts into population estimates. In the third work package, which you see in pink there, we're going to be looking at habitat preference for walrus and start to model possible scenarios for population trajectories. And then work package 4, well, that sits alongside the project, and we're going to support community-led initiatives to help prevent disturbance in some of those larger haul-out sites. And I'll hand over to Peter now to go into more of the detail.
Thank you, Rob. So yeah, we're going to go through some of the steps and the packages in more detail to give you an idea of exactly what comprises the project. The first step that we need to do is to define exactly where the walrus are, because if you look at the IPCC Red List reports about walrus, they're quite data deficient. We don't know exactly where they are or how many of them there are at the moment, and many of the reports we have are very old. Next slide, please. So we've been through all of the literature, the reports, the government reports and the conservation reports, the scientific literature, and we've spoken to a large number of scientists who deal with walrus and put together all of the data we can to make new maps and new information about where the walrus are, and when in the year they actually haul out. Because when they're not on the sea ice, they come onto land, and it's much easier to actually count them when they're on the land than on the sea ice itself. So our plan is to actually take imagery of each haul out site when they're on the land. So if you move on the next slide, please, Rob. And we've been able to make this new distribution map, or amended distribution map, with, as you can see on the left, the 3 different species or subspecies, and on the right, each different known haul out. 623 haul outs we've been able to record. Now, some of these sites or some of these records are quite old. They stretch back 50 years or so. And it's quite likely that not all of these haul outs are still being used. So as we start to get imagery of these places, we should be able to refine this map to see which sites are still in use and at what time of year. Because over the summer season, which lasts probably between about July to, in some cases, early October, some of them will come in July and some of them will come in September or October time. So we need to know if we're going to capture satellite imagery at what time of year each haul out exists. So that's the first step. We've conducted that step now. We've got this new map, and we're moving on to the second step. Next slide, please, which is to get satellite imagery. And again, we've already started this. As Rod said, we're using the satellite image, the satellite corporation Maxar, who own their own satellites and take imagery. So if you move on over the last year and in each one of the next 4 years, so 5 years in total, we're going to get at least one image, and in some cases 2 or 3 images of every one of those 623 sites, to work out the population at each site. Now, in the last year, in 2020, we got 90% coverage of the sites. So we got satellite imagery of 90% of those 623 haul outs. And that gives us some idea then, and we'll work to the next step. So the next slide, please, Rod. This is an example of what that satellite image looks like. Now, these are very high resolution satellite images. So you can see on the left, you've got an island. This island's just off Nova Zemlya in northern Arctic Russia. And as you zoom in, you can see on the right that you can actually see each individual walrus on the ground on the beach. The resolution of these images is fantastic. It's 30 centimeters per pixel on the ground. So the satellite might be 700 kilometers in the sky, but it can see individual walrus on the ground. Great amount of power. Now, that image chip you can see on the right is about 200 meters or sometimes 300 meters wide. And that's the sort of image we need to be able to say this is a walrus colony and how we count it. But the walrus tend to move around, so we need to get imagery over a much wider space than exactly this, because we don't know, for instance, on this island, whereabouts on the island it's going to be. So we need a much larger area. So this is where the crowd come in, and we've broken down our method of estimating the population into 2 or 3 steps. So if you move to the next slide, please. So the next thing is to use the crowd, the public, the citizen scientists, to help us. If you think about those image chips, each one's only 200 meters by 200 meters. We have to get all of the colonies and all of the likely locations of these colonies. We've got 600,000 of those image chips that we've got to go through. Far too many for one or even a team of researchers. And that's why we need to engage hundreds of thousands of citizen scientists to be able to look and help us to work out the population. So next slide. So we're using a crowdsourcing app called GeoHive, which is made by Maxar, the satellite image provider. And this app will come online in October and will be available to all people across the world, the whole public. And we're going to be engaging as many people as we can with this. At the moment, it's in beta testing, and we're just refining and checking that the app's right and it's got all of the right information that how to use and things. Next step, please. And this is what you'll find. The first step that we have in this app is going to tell us if there are walrus in any particular one of these image chips. So we can say we've got an image chip which is 200 by 200 meters wide, and on this particular image chip there aren't any walrus. So you've got 3 different options. Can you see walrus? Are there walrus present? Are there no walrus present? Or you can't tell because the image is bad. So it's a quick way of refining out, using the crowd, where the walrus are. When you've done this first step, we'll go on to the next step. So next one, and that's to count the walrus. And again, we do this in 2 different ways. When the walrus are in small numbers or spaced apart, we can count them individually. The imagery is of such good quality that we can actually see and count each individual walrus. And we'll do this by having an app where you place dots. In this case, each green dot on the right-hand side shows you the walrus, and the number of dots equals the number of walrus, and we'll ask the crowd to get a dot on each walrus, and you can see how many walrus there are. Not only does it tell you how many walrus there are, but by using the crowd, we can actually work out how easy it is to count the walrus. So, for instance, if we have 20 people count this image chip, and they all come to numbers, say on the top one around 37 or so, then we'll know that it's fairly accurate and probably quite easy to count the walrus. But if they start having numbers in the 50s or 10s, and there's a lot of variability in the count, then it'll give us some idea that it's actually quite a hard image to count. So not only does the crowd give us the population estimate for each site, but it also gives us some estimate of how variable or how good the count might be. So next one, please, Rob. But walrus often tend to congregate together in large groups in these haulouts. They love to be squashed up, sometimes on top of one another, even 3 deep in some cases. And when they get to this stage, it's very hard to count them individually, even with the best satellite imagery. You can do it with even better satellite imagery like drones, and that's where our ground truther will come in later. So in these cases, we'll still use the crowd, but what we'll ask the crowd to do is to delineate the mass of walrus, to draw a line around them. And you can see on the right here, we've got lines drawn around each mass of walrus. And then we can make an area estimate from it. And by using drones and very high resolution counts, which is where our field work comes in, we should be able to estimate the density of walrus and the variability in density of walrus at a number of sites. And then we can tie that back to the satellite images, because we're hoping we'll get satellite images at the same time as the counts. And that will give us density estimates, and we'll be able to tie the density of the satellite images and the area of the satellite images to what our high resolution drone counts will be, to give us accurate population estimates and an estimate of variance as well. So in that way, we'll do this over the 5 years of the project, one count for each of the 5 years, every haul out, and we'll be able to start really looking at the population of walrus, get much better figures, the population, and also the changes and the variability and the timings of the walrus. Next slide, please, Rob. And we're going to get snapshots, 1 or 2 at each colony throughout the season, but we know that the colonies vary quite a lot over the time. Here we can see imagery from a coarser satellite, the Sentinel-2 satellite, which doesn't give you the ability to see individual walrus, but it does give you the ability to see the mass of walrus. So, for instance, if you look at the images here from July to September, you can see an orange blob on the screen, and that orange blob moving on this peninsula is the actual mass of walrus. And you can see it varies, not just in its size, but also in its location over the course of the summer season. It's not there in June, it starts to get there in July, and then it sort of moves around till September, and by October it's gone, which is typical of the pattern of walrus. So the one snapshot count, however accurate it is, doesn't really tell you the whole picture, because it might not be indicative of the population. One day it might be bigger, one day it might be smaller. So by tying these coarser imagery and the areas from these coarser imagery to our really high resolution counts, will give us an idea of the variance, and also if our population estimate at a particular day is really a good representation of the colony size and what it could be throughout the season, the average and the totals at each site of these haul outs. And then the next step, if we move on please, Rob. The next step, when we've got each haul out population and the variance and the differences, and we know when it happens and changes in it, we can start tying that into the environmental variables. Things like the sea ice change. When the sea ice forms and when it retreats and changes, does that give us an indication of when and where the walrus are? This picture here is a satellite image composition of sea ice concentration on a particular day, and these are done every day throughout the season from satellite imagery. So we can tie these and other things like sea surface temperature, chlorophyll and productivity maps to the changes in the walrus populations over the 5-year period. We may not be able to define what climate change and changing ice conditions are doing to walrus over that 5-year period. It's too short. But if we start to understand how the walrus adapts to changing conditions on a seasonal and yearly basis, it will give us then information to do the last step, which is to really try and predict what's going to happen to walrus in the long run. To use IPCC predictions of sea ice loss over the future, if we have to understand a lot more about walrus, and hopefully our project will start to answer those questions so we can make reliable and robust predictions into the future about this charismatic beast. And that leads on to, I think, the last slide, which is just the final slide here, and just say that, so hopefully that our project will better inform scientists and policymakers about what's going to happen to walrus in the future, to give us some really good, robust estimates on a pan-Arctic basis, starting with the Laptev and Atlantic walrus, and possibly moving on to Pacific walruses after, and really start to hone in on these questions. We know so little about the walrus at the moment because they are really hard to study. And by using the power of the crowd and the power of high-resolution satellites and drone imagery, we really hope to be able to start to answer some of those questions, which are such important to this really brilliant species. So that's all I want to say, and I'm sure me and Rob would be very happy to take questions.
Wow. Bravo, gentlemen. That was just fantastic. It's one of the things we discussed in the planning of the festival is the connection between biodiversity and climate change. We shouldn't look at these things in these lenses, and how do we make sure that we capture everything? And your talk is the cornerstone for that. It's absolutely brilliant. I want to make sure I've got it right, but this is the right link for people to follow you, isn't it? Walrus from Space. It's the WWF link. I found it just worked pretty well. Those of you that are watching, please go down to that link to WWF page, and partway down is a brilliant video. And I've just watched it. It was a bit like going to the opera. Lots of things happening at the same time. I could hear you guys, and I was watching this video. And particularly, do look out for the October, the launch of the Maxar link. How do people know about that, fellas? Does that come up on the WWF site?
Yeah, that's right, Paul. So we'll be advertising it very widely. Hopefully, we'll be in the media as well to just make sure that everyone knows that it's out there. And we need, as Peter said, we need a lot of people to be counting Walrus for us. And it's a great way to spend your weekends.
This mass audience participation, citizen science, couldn't be better, and people are just hunting for ways to get involved. I think of the SETI program, of course, Search for Extraterrestrials, Global Fishing Watch, which we're heavily involved with at National Geographic, Pristine Sea. And they're great things because people can get involved, you can learn. Let's face it, it doesn't quite beat being up there smelling, feeling and sensing, being around these beautiful animals, but it means that you're making a difference. And in our minds, we're connecting all of these global issues around it. And I love the way that you brought in climate change, the loss of sea ice, and the walruses. I'm thinking about The Last Ice, which is one of our shared projects, Rod. This was National Geographic and WWF. I led that expedition up there in Lancaster Sound. And for those of you, it's actually predicted that it's a WWF piece of work that the last bit of multi-year ice is going to be up there in northwestern Greenland, northeastern Canada. And that will be multi-year, almost like the Serengeti of the Arctic, where we'll see all of these, beautiful Arctic megafauna. I know it's just been protected 3 years ago by the Nunavut government up there, which is great news, combined with the Canadian government, of course, and with your work, WWF. But what do you think about The Last Ice synopsis, fellas? As a Serengeti home for walrus.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, Paul. So on the one hand, it's sort of really sad that we're heading towards that stage where there are only these sort of isolated areas around the Arctic where we'll see more robust sea ice. But as you say, there's been so much effort to protect, because these are the most biodiverse parts of the Arctic, and we've seen Inuit-led calls to help manage and conserve these areas for food security, for biodiversity, and all that in the context of a really rapidly changing environment, which is just driven by the climate crisis. I
love the way you're doing it. You're capturing science and all of us public imagination by looking at these wonderful walruses. And just to say, my first time with walruses was up there in Franz Josef Land, and I always thought that quite obviously we're going to be diving with them, but it turned out none of us were brave enough.
Well, you're right, Paul. The beauty of this project is not only will the public be able to really help us, because we need so many counters as well, but it's the education and the involvement and getting people involved in the actual conservation itself and spreading that message. And the more people we can do that, if we can get 500,000 or even millions of people, it's so a great way to educate people, but also it does that two things, because we need that information as well.
Well, the great genius behind this festival is Joe Grabowski, and he runs something called Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, which we use at National Geographic to connect with schools around the world. So make sure you drop us a line, because that would be a great one to get into the schools. I think it'd be a terrific project for teachers and kids,
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And we, as well as schools, we're hoping to be engaging the scouts and the guides, and lots of youth engagement in it as well, and right around the world. So any way you can log on to the internet, you can count walrus. Brilliant.
Can you believe it? What a life. Well, look, brilliant to see you again, Rod. Hopefully next time we see each other, it's not with a laptop, it's somewhere exciting. Peter, thanks again for the book. So those of you, go onto that website, and then when you get another couple of minutes, buy Peter's book. It's absolutely amazing. All right, fellas, keep up the great work. See you soon.
Thanks, Paul. It's been a great privilege. Thank you.
Take it easy. See you.